By the time the sheriff's truck rolled up, the HOA president was already screaming that I'd stolen community property. My gate was locked. My lake was behind it. And suddenly, they were realizing they had no paperwork to prove any of it was theirs. That was the moment everything changed. What started as a temporary access issue had turned into a criminal accusation, a crowd of angry neighbors, and a board that had overplayed its hand in public. I didn't know then, but that decision cost them everything. Because the next move they made wasn't just aggressive, it was illegal. And once they crossed that line, there was no way back. The problem didn't start with a meeting or a warning letter. It started with someone acting like my land wasn't mine anymore. A week before the sheriff showed up, I noticed unfamiliar cars parked near the dirt road that runs along my lake. Not neighbors I recognized. Not maintenance trucks. Just people walking around, pointing at the water, taking photos like they were on a tour. At the time, it felt off, but not dangerous. I figured maybe the HOA was showing the common areas again. They did that sometimes. Or at least, that's what they called common areas. I'd lived there long enough to know how the board operated. Quiet control. Smiles in public. Rules that only seemed to apply when it benefited them. I kept my head down, paid my dues, didn't argue over paint colors or trash cans. I wasn't looking for trouble. And until then, trouble hadn't been looking for me. The lake was different. It had been part of my property long before the HOA existed. Deeds, surveys, old county records, all clear. The board knew that. Or at least they should have. But over the years, they'd started talking about it like it was a shared amenity. Nothing official. Just language. Community access. Shared resource. Small phrases that didn't mean much on their own. At the time, it seemed minor. That's what I didn't realize. Language was how they tested boundaries. The first message came through the HOA portal, not even a formal notice. A reminder about lake usage guidelines. Hours. Noise. Liability. It was written like it applied to everyone. I remember reading it twice, wondering why it was sent to me directly. The lake wasn't governed by their bylaws. But the message didn't say that. It just assumed agreement. That should have ended it, but it didn't. A few days later, someone knocked on my door asking where to sign in for lake access. Not an HOA member. A guest. They said they'd paid for a weekend pass. That was the moment my stomach dropped. I didn't correct them right away. I asked who sold it to them. They mentioned the HOA president's name like it was obvious. At the time, I thought it had to be a misunderstanding. I checked the online bulletin board. There was a post about exclusive lake access opportunities for residents and guests, framed as a trial program. No mention of ownership. No vote. No permission. Just confidence. And comments underneath from neighbors who assumed it was legitimate. Because why wouldn't they? They said so. Normal life kept going in between all this. Mornings by the water. Quiet evenings. But every time I stepped outside, I felt watched. Like the space around my home was being mentally claimed by someone else. The peace came in short bursts, then disappeared again. I emailed the board asking for clarification. Polite. Direct. I attached a copy of my deed. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. The response came back hours later, colder than expected. They said the matter was under review and advised me not to interfere with community programming in the meantime. That wording stuck with me. Interfere. I didn't realize what that message really meant until the warning notice arrived. It wasn't a fine. It wasn't a violation. It was a cease and cooperate letter telling me to remove any barriers restricting lake access while the HOA completed its assessment. No deadline. No legal citation. Just authority implied through tone. That's when it became clear this wasn't confusion. It was a power move. They weren't asking. They were telling. And the next step, according to the notice, would involve external enforcement if I failed to comply. That was the first time law enforcement was mentioned. Casually. Like leverage. I stood there rereading it, realizing this was already going wrong, and whatever they were planning next, it wasn't going to stop on its own. The day after that notice arrived, the lake stopped feeling like part of my home and started feeling like contested ground. I woke up to tire tracks near the shoreline. Fresh ones. Too many to be accidental. By mid-morning, two neighbors I barely knew were walking along the water with folding chairs, acting like they belonged there. I didn't confront them. I watched. I told myself I needed more information before reacting. At the time, it felt like restraint. Later, I realized it was exactly what the HOA was counting on. That afternoon, another message hit the portal. This one was shorter, sharper. It reminded residents that unauthorized obstruction of community amenities could result in daily fines. Still no vote. Still no legal citation. Just pressure. Quiet, steady pressure. I thought about responding immediately. I didn't. That hesitation gave them room. 2 days later, a laminated sign appeared near the path leading to my lake. HOA logo. Official language. It listed hours of access and included a disclaimer about private ownership under review. That phrase was doing a lot of work. It made people assume something was unsettled when it wasn't. At the time, it seemed minor. Just a sign. But it changed how everyone treated the space. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. The first fine showed up before I ever blocked access. A charge for non-cooperation. No explanation. No incident listed. Just a number and a due date. I remember staring at it, trying to understand how I could be fined for something I hadn't done. The emotional shift was subtle but real. Confusion turned into frustration. Frustration into something heavier. I paid it. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to give them leverage. That felt like the smart move. What I didn't realize was that paying it validated their authority in their eyes. The next weekend, the lake was crowded. Cars lined the dirt road. Coolers. Kids swimming. Someone set up a grill close enough that smoke drifted onto my porch. I stayed inside longer than I should have, listening to laughter outside my windows that didn't belong there. I kept telling myself it would burn out. That this trial program would collapse on its own. Instead, it expanded. A new post went up announcing premium access weekends. That's when the word sell started appearing in comments. Not officially. Casually. Like everyone understood what was happening. I didn't realize how far it had gone until someone asked me where the restroom was for lake guests. That was the moment my patience cracked. I sent another email. Firmer this time. I asked who authorized sales. I asked where the money was going. I asked why my property was being marketed. The response didn't answer any of it. It warned me again not to interfere and mentioned potential liability if I disrupted access. That line changed everything. Because it wasn't just about control anymore. It was about blame. I contacted the county recorder's office and requested certified copies of my survey and deed history. While I waited, the HOA escalated. A second fine appeared. Then a third. Different categories. Same vague wording. Each one small enough to feel annoying rather than urgent. That was the design. Every time I thought, this is the worst it can get, something new happened. A neighbor complained that my hostile behavior made guests uncomfortable. I hadn't spoken to anyone. Another claimed I'd threatened to shut down a community resource. The language was changing. They were building a narrative without me. I put up a temporary rope near the narrowest access point, not blocking the lake, just marking my boundary. Within hours, I received a violation notice with photos attached. Someone had documented it like evidence. The notice warned that continued obstruction could result in external enforcement. I didn't remove the rope right away. That felt like resistance. Small but necessary. The next morning, it was gone. Not untied. That was the first time fear crept in. Not panic. Just the realization that people felt entitled to cross lines on my land. Physical ones. And no one seemed concerned about how far that could go. I installed a gate that afternoon. Simple. Lockable. Clearly on my side of the property line. I didn't announce it. I didn't argue. I just did it. That should have ended it, but it didn't. The HOA's response was immediate. An emergency board notice went out accusing me of restricting community access without approval. They scheduled a hearing. Not optional. Mandatory attendance. Failure to appear could result in additional penalties. I didn't go. Instead, I reviewed the documents I'd received from the county. Everything was clear. Undeniable. Dates. Measurements. Signatures older than the HOA itself. Seeing it all laid out should have brought relief. Instead, it made me angry. Because it meant this wasn't ignorance. It was willful. The following weekend, someone tried to force the gate. I wasn't home when it happened. I found the damage later. Scratches. Bent metal. Nothing fully broken, but close. A message was waiting in the portal suggesting that if I continued to escalate, the HOA would involve local authorities to restore access. That phrasing wasn't accidental. They weren't threatening to investigate ownership. They were threatening to remove me. I called a local attorney for a consultation. Quite informal. I laid everything out. He listened, then paused longer than I expected. He told me not to unlock the gate under any circumstances and to document everything, especially communications. That advice gave me clarity and made the situation feel more dangerous. Because the HOA didn't slow down. They accelerated. A notice went out advertising the lake again, this time with dates and prices clearly listed. That was the moment it crossed from assumption into fraud. But no one seemed to question it. Neighbors shared the post. Commented excitedly. Treated it like a win. I felt isolated in my own community. The fines kept coming. One cited loss of community enjoyment. Another referenced potential revenue disruption. They were monetizing pressure. Every charge was a message, you're alone in this. Then came the email that changed everything. It stated that if access wasn't restored immediately, the HOA would request a welfare check and property access assistance from local law enforcement due to concerns about escalating behavior. That was the first time I realized they were willing to involve the police, not to resolve ownership, but to intimidate. I stood there rereading it, feeling the weight of what they were trying to do. Not argue facts. Not debate documents. Just overwhelm me until I gave up. I didn't respond. Instead, I reinforced the gate and installed cameras. That decision felt final. Like crossing a line you can't uncross. I knew, in that moment, whatever happened next would be public. But impossible to walk back. Because once you lock a gate on land someone else is pretending to sell, you force a choice. And I didn't know it yet, but the HOA had already made theirs. The moment the deputies arrived, everything the HOA had been pretending collapsed under its own weight. I wasn't home when the call went out. That mattered. The request wasn't framed as a dispute. It wasn't framed as a civil disagreement. It was framed as a problem that needed to be handled. Property access assistance. Welfare concern. Escalating behavior. Carefully chosen phrases designed to trigger urgency instead of questions. By the time I pulled onto my road, I could see the flashing lights through the trees. Neighbors were already gathered at a distance, phones out, watching. The gate stood exactly where I'd put it, but undamaged. The cameras blinking quietly above it, recording everything. The lake behind it was calm in a way that felt almost deliberate, like it was waiting. That was when I realized how badly the HOA had miscalculated. Because this wasn't happening in private anymore. The deputies walked the perimeter first. They looked at the gate. The posted boundary markers. The survey stakes still visible in the soil. Nothing about it looked improvised or aggressive. It looked planned, permanent, legal. And the HOA representatives standing nearby looked increasingly unsure of their own narrative. I handed over my documents. Not all of them. Just enough. Certified survey. The parcel history. Simple. Older than the HOA by decades. The kind of paperwork that doesn't need interpretation. It just needs to be read. That should have ended it, but it didn't. Because instead of stepping back, the HOA doubled down. Within hours, a new notice went out accusing me of misrepresenting ownership and interfering with a pending asset evaluation. They escalated the fines again. Higher amounts. Stronger language. They even referenced the police visit as evidence of instability rather than overreach. That was the peak of their abuse of power. They weren't trying to win anymore. They were trying to overwhelm. What they didn't realize was that every message, every notice, every fine had been preserved. Time-stamped. But matched against their own bylaws and state statutes. The pressure they applied had created a record, and records don't bend to authority. The legal letter went out the next morning. Not a threat. Not a demand. A formal notice of trespass, fraud, and misrepresentation addressed to the board as a whole. It outlined the unauthorized sale of access, the collection of money for property they didn't own, the false claims made to law enforcement. Each point supported, each consequence spelled out. I didn't realize what that letter would set in motion. Within 48 hours, the HOA's tone shifted. The portal went quiet. Notices disappeared. Posts advertising lake access were deleted without explanation. The fines stopped increasing, then stopped appearing altogether. That silence wasn't peace. It was fear. Because silence only happens when someone is trying to figure out how exposed they really are. Then the state agency got involved. It didn't come from me. That was the irony. A neighbor had filed a complaint after realizing they'd paid for access that wasn't legitimate. That single report triggered an audit request. Financial records, board communications, program approvals. Everything the HOA had treated casually was suddenly being examined by people who didn't care about titles or influence. The confidence I'd seen from the board evaporated. An emergency meeting was scheduled. Attendance mandatory. The same tactic they tried to use on me. This time, they couldn't make it optional because they needed bodies in the room. Witnesses. Support. Plausible consensus. I didn't attend. Instead, I sent a final packet. It included the audit notice, copies of the sales posts, screenshots of comments referencing prices, records of payments neighbors had unknowingly made, and a single page at the end explaining the personal liability that could attach to board members who authorized fraudulent transactions. That packet changed everything. Because the HOA wasn't a single entity anymore. It was individuals suddenly aware that the shield they thought they had didn't exist. The next escalation came fast and reckless. A new letter arrived accusing me of harassment and threatening legal action for defamation. It was vague, emotional, poorly structured, the kind of response written in panic, not strategy. They were trying to regain control by creating noise. That was their irreversible mistake. Because sending that letter triggered disclosure. Once legal threats are made, records matter even more. Intent matters. Consistency matters. And the contradictions in their own communications became impossible to ignore. Within days, the audit expanded. The bank froze the HOA's discretionary account pending review. That included the funds collected for lake access. Money neighbors had paid in good faith was now locked behind questions no one wanted to answer. The community felt it immediately. Projects stalled. Vendors paused work. Notices went out blaming temporary administrative delays. But everyone knew something was wrong. Rumors spread. Screenshots resurfaced. People started comparing messages. The power dynamic flipped. I stopped being the problem and started being the reference point. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to me in years began asking questions. Not apologizing. Just trying to understand how far this went. The lake wasn't the issue anymore. Trust was. Then the second police visit happened. This time, it wasn't about access. It was about statements. The HOA president had claimed ownership rights during the first call. That claim was now demonstrably false. Misstatements to law enforcement carry consequences, especially when documented. Especially when they result in unnecessary deployment. Watching that realization sink in was surreal. No yelling. No drama. Just a slow, visible shift as authority stopped flowing in one direction. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something colder. Relief mixed with exhaustion. Because winning like this isn't loud. It's heavy. The board issued a public notice retracting all claims to the lake. No apology. Just legal language. They framed it as a clarification rather than a correction. But it didn't matter. The damage was already done. What they didn't retract were the months of pressure. The fines. The threats. The attempt to use the police as leverage. Those were still on record. And they were about to matter. Because the final document arrived without warning. A notice of intent from the state outlining potential violations and naming individual board members for review. Not the HOA. The people behind it. The ones who had signed off. The ones who had sent the messages. The ones who thought authority was protection. Everything I thought I knew about how this would end was about to be tested. The gate was still locked. The lake was still mine. But the fallout was just beginning. It took months for everything to finally settle, but the moment the state stepped in, the direction was already locked. The audit didn't explode all at once. It moved slowly, deliberately, in a way that made the HOA far more uncomfortable than any dramatic confrontation ever could. Requests for records turned into formal demands. Informal explanations turned into sworn statements. What the board had treated like casual authority was now being measured against laws that didn't care about confidence or titles. The first visible consequence was financial. The funds collected from selling access to my lake were ordered to be returned. Every dollar. That alone caused fractures inside the community. Neighbors who had once defended the program were suddenly angry that they'd been charged at all. Others wanted to know where the money had been sitting. Questions spread faster than the board could answer them. The HOA's discretionary account remained frozen longer than anyone expected. Landscaping stopped. Planned upgrades were postponed indefinitely. Vendors refused to continue work without guarantees. The same neighbors who had applauded the board's initiative were now dealing with overgrown common areas and unfinished projects. Authority feels very different when it stops producing results. Then came the resignations. Not announced all at once. One board member stepped down for personal reasons. Another followed weeks later. The HOA president held on the longest, insisting nothing improper had happened, but once individual liability became more than theoretical, even that confidence cracked. When the president resigned, it wasn't framed as an admission of wrongdoing. It never is. It was described as a desire to move forward. But everyone understood what it really meant. The power structure that had pushed me, fined me, threatened me, and tried to use the police as leverage had collapsed under its own record. My own position became strangely quiet after that. No more notices. No more portal messages. No more carefully worded warnings. The gate stayed locked, untouched. The cameras became boring again. Days passed where the lake returned to being what it had always been to me. Part of my home, not a battleground. That silence was the real resolution. The legal side took longer, but it was decisive. The HOA formally acknowledged in writing that the lake was not a community asset and never had been. That acknowledgement was recorded. Permanent. Impossible to reinterpret later. The fines were voided. Every one of them. The board issued refunds not just for the lake access, but for penalties assessed during what they now called an administrative overreach. No apology. Just compliance. But compliance is still consequence. The most meaningful outcome didn't show up on paper, though. It showed up in how people treated boundaries afterward. Neighbors stopped assuming. Stopped pointing. Stopped treating HOA authority as absolute. Questions started getting asked in meetings. Votes were actually counted. Language in notices became careful instead of aggressive. Power, once exposed, rarely regains its old shape. There were social consequences too, quieter ones. Some neighbors avoided me entirely, embarrassed by how quickly they'd accepted the HOA's version of events. Others went out of their way to be friendly, like proximity could erase complicity. A few apologized outright. Not dramatically. Just a simple acknowledgement that they'd believed the wrong people. I didn't push for reconciliation. I didn't need to. Because the irony was impossible to miss. The board that claimed to protect the community had damaged it far more than any locked gate ever could. Property values dipped temporarily as rumors spread, then stabilized once the dust settled. The HOA rewrote sections of its bylaws, tightening limits on board authority and clarifying what could and could not be monetized. Those changes were framed as improvements, but they were really safeguards against a repeat. Safeguards written in response to what happened to me. Looking back, what still stands out isn't the confrontation or even the victory. It's how small the beginning was. A message in a portal. A sign by a path. Language that assumed ownership instead of proving it. That's how power abuse usually starts, not with force but with confidence. If I had ignored the first notice, unlocked the gate, or assumed it would resolve itself, none of the later consequences would have happened. The HOA would have succeeded quietly. The lake would have become theirs by habit, not law. And no one would have thought twice about it. That realization stayed with me. Because what seemed like a personal dispute was really a test of how far authority could stretch before someone resisted. And once resistance appeared, everything about that authority was revealed. The board didn't fall because I fought harder than they did. They fell because they created records they couldn't defend. They put pressure where patience would have worked. They mistook silence for surrender. What seemed like the end, locking a gate, was really just the beginning. Today, the lake is still mine. Undisputed, documented, respected. The HOA still exists, but it operates differently now. More cautious, less theatrical, less willing to assume people won't check. And I live in the same house, on the same land, with the same water outside my window. The difference is that I understand something now that I didn't before. Rules don't protect communities. People do. And when rules are used as weapons instead of boundaries, they eventually expose the ones holding them. So the question I keep coming back to isn't whether the HOA went too far. It's how often this happens quietly, without anyone pushing back. Because if a board can try to sell a lake it doesn't own, threaten police involvement to enforce it, and almost get away with it, what do you think they could do in a neighborhood where no one ever locks the gate?